Little Canada may be small in size, but it is big in heart. From the first canoe paddle up Jarvis Creek to the bustling traffic on I-35E, Little Canada has been called home for generations of people. Little did Ben Jarvis realize when he paddled up Phelan Creek in 1844 that he would be the person credited with settling Little Canada. Over the next 150 years, Little Canada would develop into a first-class city. And if he could see it today, Ben Jarvis would hardly recognize the rugged frontier village in which he spent his twilight years. He would, however, find many very familiar last names of the people who live here today. Great-grandchildren of the early settlers still live within an easy drive of where Jarvis made his first claim. Over the years, the little town would struggle with a devastating tornado, with the Great Depression, and the encroaching city and suburbs of St. Paul. So sit back and take a look with us at the story of a frontier town carved in the wilderness. The land that would become known as Little Canada was no secret to the scores of Native Americans that hunted among the oaks and fished in the nearby lakes. Little Canada was part of a Native American highway that followed the chain of lakes to downtown St. Paul. So many Native Americans camped by the shore of a small lake in the area, it became known as Lac de Sauvage, or Savage Lake. The Dakota Indians made Savage Lake their summer camp, and it was well known to the white traders in the area. Ben Jarvis himself, an old voyageur living in St. Paul, heard about the place from an Indian friend. This story is told by Ben's son, Basile Jarvis.
Not long after we settled at the foot of Robert Street, the Indians began telling my father what a fine location for a farm the land was at their summer camping ground. My father and the Indians always got along pretty well together, and they seemed to want to do him a favor. So he went out and examined the country, and liked it so well he determined to settle there. Basile Jarvis.
Ben Jarvis began to farm the land in the wilderness along the creek that bears his name today. He's credited with having the first commercial grist mill in Minnesota. Ben was a magnet for other settlers who followed his lead and staked out claims there. Within 3 years, there were at least a dozen families living nearby. In 1849, the territory of Minnesota officially labeled the settlement Little Canada. A census was taken at this time, and by territory standards, the Little Canada precinct was fairly large. The census showed that Little Canada had 155 people. By 1852, there was already a church, school, cemetery, and a hotel. The first form of official government for the people of this wilderness settlement was the township. When Minnesota became a state in 1858, Ramsey County was carved into 6 townships. The townships were Mounds View, Rose, White Bear, Reserve, McLean, and New Canada. New Canada's borders were Rice Street on the west, County Road D to the north, the Washington County line on the east, and Maryland Avenue to the south. The township was named New Canada, no doubt due to the largely French-Canadian heritage. The new township first met in the old Little Canada School. In 1878, a tiny town hall was erected on the north side of Phelan Lake, conveniently located near a saloon. Around 1900, it was moved to Gladstone. As St. Paul gobbled up land, New Canada's southern border was shifted to Larpenteur. Most of McLean Township was also annexed to St. Paul. A 1-mile-wide strip of land remained that became part of New Canada Township. This little stretch of land would one day become the south leg of Maplewood. Thus, there was still a large area of land called New Canada. Small villages were inside New Canada. Some later became cities, such as North St. Paul and Little Canada, and some faded away, like Gladstone and Midvale. In the 1850s, Little Canada was the most organized area of New Canada Township. It was also the final stop on the stagecoach line from St. Paul to Duluth. It took a mere 36 hours to get through the rugged wilderness from St. Paul to Superior. The price for this trip was $10, quite a healthy sum in those days. The rest stop in Little Canada was to rest and water the horses. This was to make as dashing a picture as possible when the stage reached St. Paul. Mail service now became practical, and the Little Canada Post Office was established in 1853. Abraham Lambert was the first postmaster. Abraham and Angelique Lambert followed close on Ben's heels and lived along the west shore of Lake Jarvis. The Lambert family name was given to a large lake northeast of Lake Vadnais. Lambert is one name that hasn't survived the passage of time. Lambert's lake was later drained and has also faded from memory. However, Abraham was the person who donated the land for St. John's Cemetery. One of the first things the early settlers did in this wilderness north of St. Paul was to start a church. It was a very long buggy ride to the closest church in St. Paul. Father Jean Fayol arrived in the fall of 1851 and began the Third Catholic Church in Minnesota Territory. Joseph Donnet and his wife donated land where the church would be built. In late 1852, construction began. The church was dubbed St. John's of the Wilderness and became such a well-known landmark that Little Canada was also known as St. John's City. This first church was built with tamarack logs from a nearby swamp and was 30 by 60 feet. People came from 6 miles away to hear sermons in this old church. The town slowly outgrew the little log church, and an impressive brick building replaced it in 1881. At that time, it was the tallest brick building for many miles around. The bricks for this church were made in the brickyard of Judge Bazil, with clay supplied by Sylvan Netto. When completed, this new church towered over the countryside at 113 feet. The old log church continued to be used for other church purposes for a few more years and was torn down in 1890. Eventually, the brick church became too small for the growing town, and it was torn down in December 1956. A new, much larger church was built on the same site and still stands today at the heart of Little Canada.
St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church is the heart and soul of Little Canada. This is the third building to house the church. It was built in 1957. Many priests have delivered services here in these walls, and area residents have fond memories of them.
My dearest memory is Father Combat.
Yes, he was a great priest. I really enjoyed him. When we were about 9 or 10, we'd make our first communion out there, and so the boys would sit on one side of the main aisle, and the girls would sit on the other side. And so he'd say to me all the time, "You take the girls and ask them their catechism, and I'll take the boys." I was one of the girls, you know, but he always singled me out to ask them their catechism. And then he had this little Model T coupe that he came to my grandma's store. And we'd all run to meet him because he always had a nickel for each one of us kids that met him there. And we couldn't wait, you know, to go spend that nickel in the store. My brother put his away, but we always spent ours.
The first school in Little Canada was a Catholic school that opened its doors in 1851. Lessons were taught in French, and the first teacher was Miss Elizabeth Lebon. In 1852, this school was changed into a public school, and English became the language spoken. A much larger 2-room school was built in 1862 and was known as the Little Canada School, or District 3. This building also served as the town hall for New Canada until 1879. Many students learned their 3 R's in this building until it was replaced by a new one in 1913. The Little Canada School was a long walk for children living in the northern reaches of New Canada Township. A new school, District 6B, was built in the area of Labor Road and the present Wolters Boulevard. Lorraine Ducharme Roser remembers her school days well.
We walked to school, you know, there were no buses, and I felt sorry for a lot of these mothers along the way who, it was cold, you know, And we didn't have ski pants and things like that. We had to wear just cotton stockings over long underwear. And we'd all go in and warm up when we were picking up the next child along the way. We'd all go into the house and warm up. Snow, water all over their floor, but they were so good about it. And then we'd go on our way, and if it was real cold, we'd go into the next one.
In 19th century Little Canada, most of the people residing here made their living by truck farming. Being so close to the growing metropolis to the south had its advantages. Many of the farmers would grow produce and truck it to the farmers market in St. Paul.
When my dad first started to go to market, they used to travel from home. They'd go around to Edgerton, make a right on Edgerton, and when they get to Centerville Road, they'd cut over to Centerville Road, go through Little Canada, on down to Mississippi, McMenemy. McMenemy to Mississippi, downtown, down St. Paul, right down to the market on Jackson Street. See, those streets weren't open, so they had to go around. Jackson Street goes right straight to the market from Little Canada.
During the 1880s, the residents of St. Paul not only wanted the food growing on Little Canada soil, but also were interested in the water in the shimmering lakes. The St. Paul Water Works carved out the streams running from Jarvis to Phelan Lake into more canal-like features. Not only did this enable the water to flow to the tap in St. Paul more efficiently, it also improved boating between lakes. In the 1930s, the St. Paul Water Works updated their systems. A pump house built during this era can still be seen on the northwest shore of Round Lake. Clubhouses and resorts were also popular around Jarvis and Coleman Lakes. One of these was Oakwood on Jarvis. The advertisement for Oakwood stated that it was a modern clubhouse with a rustic and cool atmosphere. The old clubhouse is still there on the north shore of Lake Jarvis, but has been altered considerably. One of the larger resorts was Coleman's Place on a strip of land between Coleman Lake and Jarvis. Buggies, tally-hoes, and people on horseback could be seen making the journey from St. Paul to this hunter's home. It was built in 1880 and stayed open until 1930. Ham's Brewery and Shock Grocery were just a few of the businesses that had their parties at the hotel. Noted in the register were room rates, guests' names, and who was in their party. Guests also recorded their success with rod and gun. And there was also a mention of gentlemen arriving at the hotel with consorts. Some wives were not too eager to have their husbands frequent the place. The lakes and the resorts were a Victorian playland. Little Canadians have always had close ties to the lake, from ice skating and ice harvesting in the winter to swimming, boating, and fishing in the summer. Lake Jarvis has been a tourist destination since the 19th century. Just at the peak of the tourist trade on Lake Jarvis, dark clouds were on the horizon. Saturday, July 13th, 1890, would be a day that many Little Canada residents would remember for years. It was a hot, sticky day, and many affluent citizens escaped the dirt and grime of St. Paul to cool off along the shores of Lake Jarvis. The Coleman Hotel was doing a brisk business. The summer cottages along Lake Jarvis were full of people. The skies darkened from the northwest, and by afternoon, the seasoned captains of the lake knew that trouble was brewing. A tornado, or a cyclone, as the papers called it, swept across the busy lake. The Coleman Hotel barely escaped the storm, but the cottages on the north shore were not as fortunate. Many of them were destroyed, and the debris was blown into the lake. Officially, 6 people died immediately in the storm, although the death toll was probably closer to 8. Many frightened people huddled in tiny cellars and survived the storm. It created an instant tourist attraction as throngs of people headed north from St. Paul to help and to to look for souvenirs. They were treated to many strange sights, such as fish flopping about on Labor Road. One person came home with a gun barrel twisted into a weird shape, and people marveled at trees stripped completely of their bark. Silverware was found in gardens many years later in the tornado area.
My mother tells about pigs being up in the trees and you know, straw being put through the wood and all kinds of things like that, yes, and that the fish were up on Labor Road from the lake, you know, from Lake Jarvis, and they told a lot of tales about that cyclone. They called it a cyclone.
That house there, and he had a steamboat on Jarvis Lake. He used to take people out for rides on Sundays, because a lot of them would come out to the hotel, Coleman Hotel, and he would ride them around the lake. And this one particular Sunday, he saw the clouds, and he turned the boat around, and the people that was on there were mad because they had a short ride. And he said, "You look up there. We'll be lucky if we make the shore." So he ordered all the people off when he got at the dock, and he went over a little ways over where there was a lot of willows, and he tied his boat onto these willows, and that was the only thing that saved his boat.
The tornado was seen throughout St. Paul, and one curious footnote to this disaster remains. A photograph that was widely distributed as the Lake Jarvis tornado was faked. It took a few years for the shoreline to recover, but eventually the Lake Jarvis tornado faded into distant memory. In the early days of the 20th century, Little Canada continued to keep its rural atmosphere. Truck farms were thriving, and many roads in the town remain unpaved. Some well-known institutions left their mark on Little Canada soil. One of these was the Bethesda Invalid Home. In 1913, the Swedish Lutheran Minnesota Conference purchased the old Wide Resort and Hotel for $5,000. It was converted into what many people remember as the Bethesda Invalid Home. Situated on the north shore of Lake Jarvis, its large verandas were popular gathering places for the patients. It was quickly filled to capacity with the old and infirm, and some of the 50-acre grounds surrounding the home were used to grow crops to feed the residents. Many of the poor were buried at the Ramsey County Cemetery near the county poor farm. By 1932, the deteriorating frame building forced the owners to close the home. It was used once more for housing after World War II veterans returned home, and it stood for years later as a windowless hulk of a building. Many people in Little Canada were truck farmers, but there has always been something of a miniature downtown around St. John's Church. Many of the early businesses in Little Canada were family affairs. One such business was William Hooley's store, tavern, and hotel. It was established in the 1870s and was located on the Kettle River Road west of the church. It served as a food source, as well as a candy store, barber shop, tobacco shop, and a tavern. They sold kerosene by the gallon and later gasoline. The Fairbanks scale to weigh the farmers' hay was here, as well as the community telephone. In the winter, it served as a gathering place for the men around the pot-bellied stove in the middle of the store. The business closed in 1920, and the building was razed for a new tavern and living quarters built by Frank Browson. This building remains in use today. Another business was Bellin's Store, located near Labor Road and West Wind Drive. It started small, with people wanting to buy Emma Bellin's wonderful bread. A few canned goods and other items were added over time, and the Bellin's Store was born. Lorraine Ducharme-Roser has fond memories of her grandmother's store. Penny candy was a magnet for children, along with the ice cream cones sold there. And if you had some inside information, you could get free ice cream.
And I'd usually get a Cheerio. It's ice cream bar, like, you know, with the stick. And I knew where the free ones were. There was one free one in every box. And I know the way that the word Cheerio was printed on there, I knew in which corner that the free one was. And I would take that nickel and get a free popsicle stick to use again later. And my grandma'd get so mad at me.
Emma retired from running the store in the 1940s. Lillian Ducharme and Fern Bellin ran the store until the early 1950s, and then the doors closed for good. When Emma died in 1968, some of the books used to keep track of charges were found, and some of the names had the word unpaid by them, showing how often Emma helped people in time of need. Another grocery store in Little Canada opened as the Bellin store was in its final years. It was the Little Canada Food Market. It opened in 1947 and was run by Florian and Earl Rosez. It was in close proximity to St. John's Church, almost too close. When the old brick church was torn down at the end of 1956, Little Canada celebrated the new year with a bang. Dynamite was used to topple the tall spire of the church, and the resulting shock wave blew out the windows of the store. Well, the store survived the blast and stayed open until the late 1960s. Many little Canadians are familiar with the Venetian Inn. The birth of this fine establishment had humble beginnings. It started as a tiny roadside vegetable stand during the height of the Great Depression. A close call with a tornado put a damper on the vegetable business, so Joseph and Kanji Vitale decided to start a 3-2 beer tavern and lunchroom on Rice Street. Despite some resistance from the town board, they were finally granted the license, and thus started the Venetian Inn. Over the years, it grew to have a seating capacity of 900 with over 100 employees. Mama Vitale even got back into the grocery business. This time, it was in the frozen food aisle with boil and bag Italian dinners, complete with her photo on the box. Many small towns have churches and grocery stores, but just about all of them have a saloon. Little Canada had quite a few over its long life. One of the most fondly remembered and still patronized today is Gordy's Place. Built on a former rhubarb patch, the small saloon was opened on May 16, 1936. Gordon and Lena Netto worked hard to keep the business going. Times were rough during World War II. Then business began to improve. When Little Canada became a village, Gordy's Place was given the first on-sale liquor license. In 1969, Gordy sold the business to Rich and Tom Cossack. The name Gordy's Place, though, remains over the door as the 21st century dawns. The Coleman Hotel site later became the location of Louis' Place, a bar and dance hall. Some other spots for libation and entertainment include Butch Godbout's Log Cabin Tavern on the north end of Lake Jarvis, the Netto Sisters on Little Canada Road, and the Spanish Villa and the Owl Inn. During the Prohibition era, the only thing a saloon could sell was a soft drink. But this didn't stop a few enterprising souls from trying the liquor racket. Many barns and silos had stills in the countryside around Little Canada. One bootlegger became a well-known local figure. He was the Cream Can Bandit. His real name was Edgar J. Loisel, and he got the name Cream Can Bandit because of his connection with the Cream Can Bandit gang of the late 1930s. Edgar had a log cabin on the north shore of Twin Lake. He was a friendly fellow unless the gate to his property was closed. This meant that his friends from faraway places like Chicago were planning a job. One of the notorious friends was Al Capone, who had a place at nearby Goose Lake in White Bear. Eventually, the Ramsey County sheriffs caught up to the bandit, and he wound up dying in prison. The closest hospital to Little Canada was miles away. Luckily, there was a doctor who was like a one-man clinic to literally thousands of people from the east side of St. Paul north to Little Canada. This man was Edgar Ostergren. Dr. Ostergren went to the small Edgerton School halfway between Little Canada and St. Paul. And when he went to the University of Minnesota, he became a medical doctor simply because it was cheaper than studying engineering. Eventually, he began his practice on Payne Avenue, where he would be for 47 years. The first baby he delivered later became Mrs. Joseph Mama Vitale. In all, he delivered over 4,000 babies. Fire protection became more of an issue when the city of St. Paul advised New Canada that they would no longer provide service. The Lake Jarvis Improvement Association, led by Fred Memmer, talked to the local residents about fire protection. The areas to the east of Highway 61 were already serviced by the Gladstone Fire Department. The Little Canada Fire Department would serve areas west of Highway 61. An organizational meeting was held in March of 1945. Michael Stasinski was elected as chief, and the first piece of equipment was a pumper on skids powered by a Chrysler motor. In addition, each member was issued a 5-gallon pump can. Volunteers sold cement blocks door to door to build the foundation of a fire hall, and this building still stands today, although it is no longer used as a fire hall. In 1946, the fire department got their first fire truck. It was an International Harvester truck purchased from Don Brings. The first fire call was, ironically, at the home of Ollie Berthomew, where the fire truck had been kept while the fire station was under construction. The fire department today is a first-rate firefighting operation. One of the biggest fires in Little Canada was the Grand Prix Apartments. This was a large fire and really put the firefighters and equipment to the test.
Those are memorable, but you know, over the years we've had some larger fires where fortunately there was no citizens lost, but the Venetian Inn, I can remember standing there watching that. I was a rookie then and we weren't allowed to go in the building with a mask on, and we had that. And as the years evolved, the explosion up on County Road C, an office building that was of a large magnitude. And of course, probably one of the largest apartment fire in a complex in the metro area was the Grand Prix, where there was over 70 units that burnt. Many people may recall that back in 1991. And most recently here fortunately we had the foresight to buy a ladder truck for the bigger buildings and things that we have here, but the Canterbury townhomes was a very large scale fire where 4 of those large units went. And of course, without that ladder truck, more would have went. And the Carley townhomes here just 2 years ago was a large scale, larger building fire, you know. So over the years, yeah, there's been our share. And of course, you always have ongoing house fires. And today, with the response time and the equipment and the advance warning that you can get through via the smoke detectors and other devices that give us a little head start on it, fortunately, those numbers are down.
For police protection, Little Canada relied on elected constables. Some lawmen, such as Paul Holmstrom, David Fratellone, and Myers Slim Fratellone, kept the peace. Some of the biggest crimes in Little Canada were of the canine kind. Roaming dogs were an annoyance to residents, and the constables got paid 75 cents an hour to remove dogs from the schoolyards. What was the beat of Little Canada like? Well, this is best answered by one of the men who saw action.
I took care of the bars and took home the fellas that had too much to drink. I took them home, and the wives were the judge, and they got it. They had them for murder and for something else, and we found them up in a tree by Edgerton. There's some detectives from St. Paul and myself, and we got them, and I don't know what happened to them. It was just, I enjoyed it, you know, but, you know, it was part-time, but I'd work till 2 in the morning, till things quietened down. They'd see me around, they'd kind of behave. You know, I'd stop in all our saloons and make a peekaboo, and they were all pretty good. And if someone was out of hand, I'd stop them, park their car, and take them home. And that was it.
Eventually, Little Canada received police protection from the Ramsey County Sheriff's Department. As the 1940s arrived, the character of New Canada Township began to change. The Gladstone area to the south of Little Canada began to attract World War II veterans. This was the first time that relatively high-density housing was built in New Canada, and the people who lived in these homes wanted improved roads and possibly a sewer connection with St. Paul. This alarmed the residents in the northwest portion of the township. A plan began to circulate by the early 1950s to break away from New Canada and form a village. This way, the residents of the Little Canada area could preserve a more rural way of life. This plan to incorporate was met with some opposition. The persons for the formation of Little Canada outweighed the ones against it, and by a 5-to-1 vote, the village of Little Canada was formed on October 13, 1953. The split with the township was a friendly one. The new village of Little Canada got to keep the fire hall on Little Canada Road, a truck, some office equipment, and a horse-drawn grader that was worth $50. Some of the new officers of Little Canada were former members of the New Canada Township Board. The first mayor was longtime resident Louis Melanson. Louis was an employee of the Northern Pacific Railroad. Many people in the village had a fondness for his French meat pies and his dumplings at the St. John's Church dinners. Trustees were Carl Spooner, Edward Leffler, and John Vitale. Ernest Enstrom was the first treasurer, and Roy P. Netto was the first clerk. A dog control ordinance was one of the first things passed, as well as control on the sale of liquor. Little Canada was able to postpone the suburban boom that occurred around the Twin Cities in the 1950s. One method was to limit lot sizes to half an acre. Sanitary sewers were not part of the early village plan. Despite these measures, population in Little Canada continued to grow. From 1950 to 1957, the population increased from 2,050 to 3,800. Eventually, with the added people living in the village, talk began about the need for sanitary sewers. A bitter debate began in the late 1960s when some federal money became available to help offset the cost. It was a painful decision for the council. Some people in the village would pay more depending on how much land they had on the road. Ultimately, the vote was in favor of connecting Little Canada to the sewer line, and by 1973, most of the village was serviced by the sewer system.
Between the various persons of the area, and so the primary vocation, or I should say, of the total area, and they're going to float a $3 million bond issue to come in with sewer. Why, who needs it? Who wants it? It'll bankrupt us. As I mentioned earlier, the truck gardening aspect, many of the persons owned the land, had large tracts of land. Somebody got to pay for that pipe in the ground. And there was fear that they were going to be bankrupt. So to ease and appease to a certain degree, we had many deferments that had to be granted to these people on more or less a hardship basis. If you had 400 foot of frontage and the minimum lot frontage was 75 foot, which you had to have for your home, the other 325 feet, the pipe had to go to get to the neighbors. Somebody got to pay for it. So we had many early deferments where people were granted a deferment that only meant that the property assessment was there, but they weren't going to have to pay it until such time as they sold it or developed it, and yet the interest went on and it had to be paid. So again, these were some of the times, tough times. I've got information here where petitions for, this is hard to imagine, it's only 23 years ago, 1975. Here was a letter that went out to the property holders of Little Canada, talking about April 9th, 1975, 8 p.m., City Council of Little Canada vote on a citywide water project. And well, these people were saying the City Council must listen to the voice of the people and urging you to get out there. And this was a time that, boy, I'll tell you, a lot of people were up in arms.
Due to the increased population of the Twin Cities, a ribbon of asphalt was planned that would divide Little Canada. The state had decided to put Interstate 35E right through the heart of Little Canada and slice Savage Lake in half. Naturally, the old truck farmers were not happy with this prospect. Some property was divided by the highway, and it was a long trip to get to the other side. One good thing that came out of the improved roads was that it was a quick trip to St. Paul, and this made it attractive to larger businesses. With the city utilities in place, the door was open for more development. And for the first time, apartment buildings were built, with 7 complexes by 1972. The village of Little Canada grew to a population of over 5,000 and became the city of Little Canada. One benefit derived from this was that Little Canada could get a share in gasoline taxes. From 1975 to 1989, Little Canada received $1.5 million from these taxes. Commercial businesses began to eye Little Canada for a place to call home. One interesting problem was solved rather cleverly. Saunas and massage parlors were common around the time that the village began. People were suspicious that this might be a front for a less desirable business. To try to head off this problem before it occurred, the annual license fee was set at the incredible amount of $10,000. Some of the common early troubles of the village involved roaming livestock.
Oh, yes. We had some rather humorous ones at the time. I always like to laugh now about Hamill's goats, as we called it. We had episodes where citizens would call and complain that the neighbor's goat was in their yard eating their grass and doing other things that animals do in their yard, or the cows were loose from another area of the city and were in their land, and we'd have to deal with those very critical issues at the city council. And
one of the largest employers arrived in 1982. The story of how St. Jude Medical came to Little Canada is told by Ray Hansen, who was the mayor at the time.
Well, I'll tell you kind of an amusing and amazing story now. A friend of mine, name was Don Roberts, and he owned the tract of land that was first developed by St. Jude Medical. And this is the property that is along Viking Drive and bordered on the north by County Road B2. And I was mayor at the time, and Don called me and he says, say, I'd like to have you get together for lunch. He says, I've got some people that are interested in buying that 28 acres, and he said, I'd just like to have you get together and meet some of the principals and see if there's some way that we might be able to help them get located in Little Canada. Sure, Don, that's fine. And so we met, and after we went through all the niceties of the introductions and so on and so forth, he started to ask these principals about their nature of their business, heart valve business, this and that and the other thing, and it all sounded very interesting to me. And a little while later, he says, all right, Ray, he says, let's knock this off. He says, what is it going to take to be able to get St. Jude into Little Canada? Well, I kind of leaned forward a little bit. I said, Don, what have you got under the table? Well, these people that were with him, they were shell-shocked. This was like a bribe. I'm asking them, what do you got under the table? Knowing full well and good that whatever I did was not going to be worth a darn if they didn't go through the Planning Commission, if they were not well received by the council.
Despite the size of the St. Jude Medical Facility, it is almost invisible to people driving by. The planners did a wonderful job of making the buildings fit in with the surrounding trees. For 20 years, existing as a village, then a city, Little Canada had no official city hall. Little Canada officials were using the old fire hall for meetings and had offices at St. John's Credit Union. When the rent at the fire hall was raised to $100 a month in 1965, the need for a city hall became more of an issue. In 1973, a special referendum was held to see if the residents approved of building a city center. The referendum passed with a vote of 117 to 77. And these were lucky numbers for the crowded staff of Little Canada, and the new city center was dedicated on June 9th, 1974. Part of Little Canada's legacy was that it was divided into 2 school districts. Most students attend Roseville Area School District 623. However, a few attend White Bear Lake School District 624. In the past 30 years, Little Canada has fought to retain some neighborhood schools.
But when they talked years ago about closing either Falcon Heights School or the Little Canada Elementary School, I remember going to a school board meeting with a ream of paper and identifying to the school board that the growth in this school district is going to come from the northeast quadrant of the district, which is Little Canada, and identified and all the land that was yet to be developed.
In 1953, the city had no parkland at all. Today, Little Canada has over 9,000 people and 98 acres of city parks. One park created by the city is the Jarvis Mill Park, which boasts replicas of the original stones that Ben Jarvis used to grind flour. Spooner Bicentennial Park was named after Carl Spooner, and some old homes were removed to make way for Pioneer Park. There are many civic organizations in the city, including the 55 Plus Club, the Recreation Association, the Fire Department, the Historical Society, and the Canadian Days Committee. One of the long-term plans of the city is to redevelop the Rice Street area and perhaps reinvent the downtown.
And also, we're trying very hard to redevelop some areas in our major oldest street in the city, Little Canada Road, right where it meets Rice Street. Through the years that's developed and it's ready for some redevelopment. The city has been taking a very active role in that, and our city administrators helped us greatly in that respect. But we've taken a very active role in trying to get some quality development because we need a downtown in Little Canada. And people are asking for a downtown. We've had major community meetings and they want a downtown. They want a gathering place. And so we've looked at a place where we can enmesh parkland with some quality development, maybe in a streetscape type environment, so people would feel comfortable walking the streets and yet seeing some nice plantings, small streets so that they can walk around and not be intimidated by the freeway systems and the large highways that we have. A place for reflection and shopping. As people today like to shop, they want to walk, they want to enjoy company of other people. Actually, downtown Little Canada is pretty much at Little Canada Road, which is the old Kettle River Road from the long ago days, and Rice Street. That's actually downtown Little Canada. It doesn't look like it yet, but I challenge you in 20 years to look at it. It will look better than it does today, and we will be happy that we took an active role in 1999 to see that that happens.
Okay.
Main Street will be Little Canada Road. How can anything else be the main street? That will be it, and we'll carry on the tradition. We have our cross street. We have our access at the freeway. Everyone will know where Little Canada is. We will always have a presence in this metropolitan area.
Little Canada remains proud of its heritage and its community. The residents value art and history as well as open spaces. The old landmark of St. John's Church is still there, along with newer structures that dot the landscape. What will Little Canada look like in 20 years? Well, whatever develops in the future, Little Canada will survive and flourish. Benjamin Jarvis would be happy to see the city that has developed at the end of his canoe journey. And many people will continue to be proud to call Little Canada home for generations to come.